Institute, and it's a great pleasure to have you with us. As you know, the topic of the lecture is the international state system after neoliberalism. He's going to talk about Europe between national democracy and supranational centralization, picking up three themes which have characterized a lot of his work: the crisis of capitalism, the ill-matched pair democracy and capitalism, the tensions between the two of them, and his concerns about the EU as a supranational organization. Wolfgang Streeck is Emeritus Director of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies, where he was director for 20 years in Cologne, and from where he retired in 2014. He's Professor Emeritus of Sociology also at the University of Cologne. And he was, in 2016, elected Corresponding Fellow of the British Academy. In 2012, he received the award for Outstanding Contribution to the Public Understanding of Sociology by the German Sociological Association, to name two of the most recent awards that he has received. His writings have focused on the political economy of capitalism. And I think what I could do, the easiest characterization would be to use Kathleen Taylor's word when she gave a laudatio for him upon his retirement from the Max Planck Institute. She said, like capitalism, we could describe Wolfgang Streeck as dynamic, creative, restless, and risk-taking. And I think this is a wonderful summary of his work, of his career, which has really been seminal in shaping his discipline in the German-speaking world and much beyond it. Let me just mention three books to recall those for those of you who have read them. For those of you who have not, this would be a short book list. A highly discussed book is Buying Time, The Delayed Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, published by Verso in 2017, in which he talks about both the crisis of democratic governance and the aftershocks of the economic crisis that began in 2008. But he really takes a long look at this crisis, beginning already with his analysis in 1970s, making the argument that one of the processes that we need to think about seriously and critically is the one which got states to turn away from taxation towards debt as their major source of revenue. And this is where one of the major problems of the changing relationship also between capitalism and democracy lies, not only in Europe, but also elsewhere. And he shows why it is a problem when capitalism immunizes itself from democratic accountability. So the prophetic titled book, How Will Capitalism End? Essays on a Failing System in 2016 has also diagnosed the ill health of capitalism. He thinks capitalism is a critical condition, that growth has given way to stagnation, but of course questions of inequality are at the center of his analysis as well. Inequality paired with the instability that it causes socially and the lack of confidence in the market as a result of the shocks which we have witnessed. One of the foci of his work has been the absence or the weakness of regulatory institutions which once were able to restrain and constrain the financial sector. And he has looked at how these have successively collapsed and the final victory of capitalism at the end of the Cold War, such that there is a lack of a political agency today which could be a bulwark against the ills of neoliberalism. Let me just mention one more book, which is an edited volume, 2013, Politics in the Age of Austerity, because here he picks up a lot of the problems of increasing austerity measures, which are also causing an enormous strain for democratic politics. I think in the elections, the growing success of populist right-wing parties, we see one of the results of the kinds of problems that he has pointed to in OECD countries, which have run up large deficits and accumulated debts, wherever smaller parts of government revenue is available today for discretionary spending and investment. And therefore, there is, in a way, a constraint on the state which irrespective of whichever party comes to power, this is the kind of constraint and a straitjacket, a financial straitjacket, which governments are unable to avoid. In German, just so that for those who would like to or prefer to read it in German, Gekaufte Zeit, die vertagte Krise des demokratischen Kapitalismus is the German title of his 2015 work. We look forward to a discussion of capitalism and of democracy and the crises of the EU with you this evening. After your lecture, we'll have a short Q&A, and I very much hope that we will see the lecture in print with us in our new series with the Passagen Verlag. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation, for being here this evening, and I'll give you the word.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming on this very hot day. I will speak, this will not be an American lecture which ends after 40 minutes, but it won't be an Italian lecture either, which ends after 120 minutes. So, but you have to be ready to listen to me for 60 minutes. And this is serious listening, because I brought a manuscript, and so it's going to be a little bit dense. The international state system after neoliberalism, Europe between national democracy and supranational centralization. Now, I begin with an essay that Karl Polanyi wrote in 1945, 1 year after his great transformation. A short, densely argued article in a journal called London Quarterly of World Affairs, under the title of Universal Capitalism or Regional Planning, ? In it, in this essay, he explores the relationship between what he calls the organization of the international life and the structures and domestic and foreign politics of the leading states of his time, arguing that changes underway in them potentially offered a prospect of a new, I quote, far-flung and meaningful policies which may, albeit incidentally, fulfill the deeply rooted aspirations of the common man. Focusing on Great Britain, Russia, and America, the three global powers left standing by the Second World War, Polanyi argues that what was now at issue between them was not so much their place in a given pattern of power as the pattern itself. Here, the tremendous event of our age was the simultaneous downfall of liberal capitalism, world revolutionary socialism, and racial domination, the three competing forms of universalist societies. I think by racial domination, although he isn't explicit there, he believes both he means both German Nazism and the end of colonialism. According to Polanyi, it was precisely because of this end of universalism that a new era of international politics had become possible, allowing for peaceful coexistence of different regional regimes of international order based on and including different settlements of the class conflict. I quote, "World revolutionary socialism was overcome by regional socialism in the sufferings and glories of the 5-year plans, the tribulations of the trials, and the triumph of Stalingrad. Liberal capitalism came to an end in the collapse of the gold standard, which left millions of unemployed and unparalleled social deprivation in its wake. Hitler's principle of domination is being crushed on a battlefield coextensive with the planet he attempted to conquer. And out of that great mutation, various forms of inherently limited existence emerge. New forms of socialism, of capitalism, of planned and semi-planned economies, each of them by their very nature regional. So he uses the concept of regional in the Anglo sense, regions of the world rather than subnational units. Polanyi's principal example for the salutary international consequences of the change he saw from universalism to particularism is the breakdown of the gold standard in the interwar years, ending the 19th century system of world economy, as he calls it, and resulting in the immediate emergence of economic units of limited extent. Each of these was now forced to look after its own foreign economy, as he calls it. And I think this is a somewhat clumsy translation of the German word Außenwirtschaft. Außenwirtschaft, yeah. Was forced to look after its own foreign economy, which has formerly looked after itself in the liberal world. Quote, new organs had to be developed. New institutions had to be set up to cope with the situation. The peoples of the world are now living under these new conditions. Their foreign economy is the government's concern. Their currency is managed, their foreign trade and foreign loans are controlled. Their domestic institutions may differ widely, but the institutions with the help of which they deal with their foreign economy are practically identical. The new permanent pattern of world affairs is one of regional systems coexisting side by side. To explore the emerging pluralist pattern of world affairs further, Polanyi first considers the United States, which he regards as a notable exception, quote unquote, and in this respect a potential source of systemic instability. The US, he writes, quote, has remained the home of liberal capitalism and is powerful enough to pursue the utopian line of policy involved in such a fateful dispensation, namely to attempt, quote, to restore the pre-1914 world order together with its gold standard and manifold sovereignties. Utopian because, according to Polanyi, such restoration is inherently impossible. For historical reasons, Polanyi continues, Americans still believe in a way of life no longer supported by the common people in the rest of the world, but which nevertheless implies a universality which commits those who believe in it to reconquer the globe on its behalf. 1945. This was different with the Soviet Union, where, quote, the victory of Stalinism over Trotskyism means a change in her foreign policy from a rigid universalism relying on the hope of a world revolution to a regionalism of revolutionary policy. The startling novelty of Stalin's policy, Polanyi writes, was that he was willing to content himself with building a cordon sanitaire around Russia of countries that did not have to be socialist or communist, provided their class structures were reshaped so that they were no longer likely to support deadly attacks on Soviet Russia. All that was needed was the destruction, quote, destruction of the political power of the feudal classes. A revolution, quote, far safer than the traditional unlimited socialist one, which at least in Eastern Europe would either provoke a fascist counter-revolution or else could maintain themselves or itself, this is wrong, could maintain itself only with the help of Russian bayonets, which Russia has no intention of providing. Nothing, Polanyi continues, could be less appealing to the conventional revolutionary than the Stalinist turn from revolutionary universalism to this kind of regionalist particularism. Polanyi was not a communist. The upshot, as seen by Polanyi, was that, quote, the British Commonwealth and the USSR now formed part of a new system of regional powers, while the United States insists on a universalist conception of world affairs, which tallies with her antiquated liberal economy. Regionalism, as a formula for peace among neighboring countries, recognizes the communitarian particularism, that's my paraphrase, of the human condition, and draws practical lessons from the observation during the war of, I quote Polanyi, how overwhelmingly the people rally behind policies designed to protect their community from external danger. Obviously Russia in mind. It was in exchange for a secure national existence, so Polanyi, that the Russia of 1945 asked its regional neighbors to rid themselves of incurably reactionary classes through expropriations and eventually confiscations, reorganizing themselves not in order to adopt a universal model of a good society, but to be capable of living in peace with their neighbors. Socialization of the new kind, Polanyi writes with reference to Eastern Europe and the regional neighborhood of the victorious Soviet Union, was emphatically not an article for export. It was a foundation of national existence. It is in his further examination of what he thought was the emerging post-war peace settlement for the Eastern European region that Polanyi arrives at the core of his argument in favor of a regionally subdivided, planned global order. Eastern Europe, Polanyi notes, was traditionally beset with at least three endemic political diseases: intolerant nationalism, petty sovereignties, and economic non-cooperation. Here as elsewhere, the rise of nationalism, according to Polanyi, quote, coincided with the territories brought under the control of a credit system by autochthonous middle classes. Moreover, ethnic conflicts, in Polanyi's words, quote, unresolved racial issues, not only interfered with the functioning of markets across national borders, but were also reinforced by unfettered economic competition between countries with a gold standard foreign economy, forcing governments to leave it to the markets to balance their country's external accounts. This, Polanyi claims, and Polanyi readers know the argument, this, Polanyi claims, came to an end whenever during the interwar period market methods were, under Soviet Russian leadership, discarded for planned trading. Now, very importantly, then intractable chauvinisms lost their viciousness. National sovereignty became less maniacal, and economic cooperation was regarded again as being of mutual help instead of being feared as a threat to the prosperity of the state. In effect, as soon as the credit system is no longer based on confidence, but on administration, finance, which rules by panic, is deposed and sanity can prevail. The lessons Polanyi drew from this for the rest of the world were far-reaching. If, he writes, the Atlantic Charter really committed us to restore free markets where they have disappeared, we might thereby be opening the door to the reintroduction of a crazy nationalism into regions from which it has disappeared. Liberal capitalism would then become a matter of foreign policies based on foreign buying and selling, lending and borrowing, and the exchange of foreign currencies carried on between individuals as if they were members of one and the same country, with the market expected to balance the economic relations between countries automatically, that is, without the intervention of their governments. You might want to think of the European Monetary Union. This failed in the 1930s, he says, and the gold standard had to be abandoned. Now, regional planning offered new methods of foreign economy that are conducive to international peace and cooperation, as they allowed for mutually beneficial distribution of raw materials, the stabilizing of prices, and even the ensuring of full employment in all countries. It was only the United States that was trying to resolve these issues with, quote, a universal system of marketing, although this would involve the impossible task of first restoring the market system throughout the world. While it might take time for the United States to understand that its idea of Außenwirtschaft is doomed to failure, the promising alternative to the reactionary utopia of Wall Street, Polanyi writes, is deliberate development of the new instruments and organs for foreign trading, lending and paying, which constitute the essence of regional planning. Polanyi ends his discussion with a fascinating analysis of the situation of the United Kingdom, the country where he was then living. And we could extend this to the whole Brexit debate, but we won't do this here. It's clear enough what he says. In short, Polanyi saw Britain dependent on imports, quote, for maintaining a civilized standard of life and for the survival of the Commonwealth, on free cooperation with overseas dominions, which were no longer colonies. A planned foreign economy would enable Britain to, quote, reap the huge economic and political advantages of the regional organization of the world. In fact, after the changes it had undergone since the 1930s, Britain was no longer a free trading country at all, a process that had made it more of a popular democracy than ever. Quote, more healthily, 1945, more healthily united with every year that has passed since she left the atmosphere of liberal capitalism, free competition, the gold standard, and all the other names under which a market society is hallowed. This, however, was not yet irreversible. The real issue today, Polanyi wrote, was that reactionaries still hope that it is not yet too late for Britain's own system of foreign economy to be changed back, so that it may fall in line with that of America. The Trump visit comes to mind. This way, Britain would not just lose the advantages of equal cooperation with the United States and the Soviet Union, but soon would be deprived, quote, of those organs of international trade which she needs for her survival, as well as for her freedom of action, rising standard of life, and the advantages of a constructive peace for a long time to come. American-style economic universalism would imply a return to the gold standard in substance, if not in name. The battle over the gold standard, Polanyi adds, is in reality a battle for and against regional planning. Fighting that battle on the side of, quote, a universalist conspiracy to make the world safe for the gold standard, where the old ruling classes of British society, afraid of a new egalitarian impulse that might, quote again, and this is the end of this summary, that might fuse the Israelis, two nations into one. Contrary to national interest, they might attempt to restore universal capitalism instead of striking out boldly on the paths of regional planning. So now I have laid out the conceptual toolkit, and I will go to discuss what really happened. And the next section is headlined "The Rise and Decline of Neoliberalism." What became of the world, as projected by Karl Polanyi, at that fateful historical turning point, the end of the 20th century's great destruction? While some of his predictions were obviously falsified by the course of events, others were not. Even his misses and near misses, however, appear astonishingly useful for description and analysis of developments since 1945. To begin with, the regionalization of socialism inside the cordon sanitaire around the Soviet Union's communism in one country proved less resilient to US universalistic expansionism than hoped for. As Polanyi anticipated, the United States did its utmost to export its system to the rest of the world in confrontation with the other remaining superpower, and was remarkably successful. Offers of Marshall Plan aid to Eastern European countries, conditional on the adoption of a market economy, threatened to turn the Soviet Union's regional neighbors into hostile allies of its global rival, and were countered by military support for a revolutionary conversion to the Soviet political economic order. For roughly 4 decades, Eastern and Central Europe became incorporated in a more or less tightly integrated Soviet-Russian empire, confronted by and confronting a Western alliance of democratic capitalist or liberal corporatist states built originally on the model of the American New Deal. That other Western empire held together even when its hegemonic power, beginning in the 1980s, the United States, embarked on a global return to the precepts of economic liberalism, pure and simple, no longer allowing its client states to choose between different national economic and social policies under the protection of Bretton Woods Keynesianism. This coincided with the Soviet Union finally losing the support not just of its client peoples, but also of its own citizenry, as a result of both heavy-handed repression and the lures of consumer capitalism. In 1990 then, communism was ready to collapse into global capitalism, which subsequently felt free to abandon even the pretense of democratic redistributionism at home and pluralist institutionalism abroad. What looked like the victory, however, even like unconditional surrender, was only of short duration. Very soon, the sole remaining superpower, the by then uncontested hegemon of the capitalist world, began to suffer from overextension, just as previous imperial powers inevitably had. Lost wars beginning in Vietnam and not ending in Afghanistan, and failed prospects of nation building like in Iraq, or of regime change like in Syria, Iran and Libya, came together with continuing neglect of domestic problems like a decaying infrastructure and rising inequality, as economic growth became reserved for a tiny oligarchy of private beneficiaries from public empire. Strong isolationist tendencies among the electorate and resounding calls for economic protection against the world market in which the United States was no longer able to guarantee its citizens a secure seigniorage paved the way to the US presidency for an apparent isolationist come protectionist, America first, like Donald Trump. The result was a standoff between the capitalist imperialism and the entrenched international elites of the East Coast, aligned with the country's huge military establishment, and the new populist mainstream, interested neither in international adventures nor, with Polanyi, a free market foreign economy. Now, just as an aside, it is absolutely mind-blowing if one tries to imagine the sheer size of the American military power, yeah, and the enormous number of countries where they have their special ops operating some special things. And it's unbelievable. I mean, it's 40% of the world's expenditure on military hardware and software. Yeah. Turning to Western Europe, we find another historical trajectory that fits Polanyi's concepts while deviating from his predictions. In the 1950s, in good part at the instigation of the United States, Western European countries did in fact engage in what came remarkably close to what Polanyi had called regional planning. The European Community for Coal and Steel in particular was created, among many other similar institutions like the European Payments Union, to jointly administer a specific sector of cooperating national economies, taking into account national economic needs and interests, thereby stabilizing peaceful relations among what were now the European members of an anti-communist Western alliance. Placing the key industries of industrial capitalism under supranational control, coal and steel, was to prevent them being used by defeated Germany, like in the 1930s, for nationalist rearmament. It also gave neighboring countries secure access to German coal and steel, making it unnecessary for France in particular, again to occupy the Ruhr Valley, with the disastrous consequences this had for peace in Europe, and helped manage the economic fortunes of an industry, steel in particular, with strong trade unions and a tradition of labor conflict. Later, yet another sector, nuclear power, believed at the time to be of foundational importance for a modern economy, was in the same way entrusted to a special international organization, Euratom, again very much in line with the model of regional planning envisaged by Polanyi. Soon, however, regional planning changed into something else. Step by step, the scope of supranational jurisdiction increased, and so did the number of countries involved, from 6 originally to 12 in 1989, and no less than 28, soon perhaps 27 today. What had set out as joint sectoral planning began to appear for a short while in the 1970s as a prelude to regional state building. Sectoral technocratic administration seemed to be turning into general political authority, prospectively replacing national states with a supranational European superstate and indeed super welfare state, as horizontal cooperation seemed to be shading into hierarchical federalism. But rather than sovereign national states merging into a sovereign supranational state, something that incidentally never came to pass anywhere since the era of the nation state after the Second World War began in earnest, what happened, only Germany is the only exception, yeah? But otherwise you see Czechoslovakia separating into two peacefully, or Yugoslavia less than peacefully, but it's always separatism. And Germany was a special case, of course. So what happened, in fact, was the merger of national economies by international treaties into a sectorally encompassing supranational market economy. That economy was released from redistributive state intervention, not by the political will of a state coterminous with it, a state that might, by popular democratic pressure, be moved to change direction, but by a regional cluster of states banding together to keep each other in the neoliberal fold. Proceeding alongside with the return of the United States to its historical pattern of unfettered market liberalism, state-free market building in economically integrated but politically ununited and therefore only negatively integrated liberal Europe, moved after the collapse of communism and the breakup of its European empire into international empire building. A liberal empire of 28 states joined together by a stateless, supranational, post-democratic, pre-Keynesian market economy, kept together in turn by a hard German-style common currency. As Polanyi would not have been surprised, the transition in the final decades of the 20th century from regional planning to a new old pattern of capitalist universalism, institutionalized in a neoliberal regional superstate, in Polanyi's perspective, a regressive reversal of post-war historical progress, revived the national and international conflicts of the era of the gold standard. In particular, within European Monetary Union, relations between European countries are worse today than ever in the post-war period. Germany in particular, the new hegemon under the hard currency it has bestowed willy-nilly on its Western European allies. Remember that the Germans didn't want it, the Italian and the French wanted it, has become the target of deep nationalist animosities, especially among Mediterranean countries, including France. As countries find themselves and their foreign economies in unmitigated competition with one another, a condition that they cannot do anything about under the four freedoms of the market, and in particular the common currency that have become constitutive for the Europe of European integration, and they are enshrined in treaties, not in legislation, or in jurisdiction of the European Court, which is totally immune to any political change. The popular counter movements have sprung up that are rediscovering the institutional resources of national democracy to force governments to abandon their studied passivity and protect their society's economic fortunes and accustomed ways of life from the creatively destructive forces of globalization. After the center-left, in most, if not all, of the countries involved had in the 1990s, at the latest, tied its future to a neoliberal revival of capitalist growth. Sorry, I have these new glasses. The first time I'm wearing this, I have to find out how to put my head to be able to read this. Yeah, it's unbelievable, but it comes with age. After the center-left in most of one's countries involved had tied its future to a neoliberal revival through economic internationalism, it is only the nationalist right that is today offering protectionist political rhetoric that speaks to those who feel threatened by an open society identified with a neoliberal economy. Since 2008 in particular, declining confidence in neoliberal global governance and its promise of universal economic achievement for those who, with Hillary Clinton, who work hard and play by the rules, fueled the rise of new political parties denounced as populist by the established political class and its media that have broken up the centrist politics of post-war Western European democracy. This is something I can take from the book of Chantal Mouffe, who describes that process in exactly these terms. The result was and is an impasse between two incompatible political economic projects: the neoliberal, supranationally centralized, top-down technocracy of globalization, a neoliberal superstate or a supermarket without a corresponding state, held together by a firmly institutionalized de facto international gold standard on the one side, and the anti-liberal, nationally decentralized, bottom-up democracy of often reactionary, popular counter-movements of various kinds of colorations. Mind you that I personally use the term democracy not to mean a catalogue of middle-class values to which Democrats, if they want to be ones, must subscribe. Rather, I mean institutions that give losers, political as well as economic losers, a chance to organize and thereby gain the attention of the winners. That's, to me, the democracy. Yeah. One issue this raised was that of political scale. Whether it was preferable for a political jurisdiction to be large or to be small, to merge with others to form a larger or split from others to form a smaller unit of governance. Today it appears that in this impasse, the neoliberal advance has come to a halt, resulting for the time being in a political interregnum, which everybody quotes Gramsci today, in which the old order is dying while a new order cannot yet be born. And Gramsci adds to this, a time in which all sorts of monstrosities can happen. Yeah. Polanyi's analytical toolkit may be profitably used to shed new light on the British Brexit politics. And here I return to this, on the particularly complex configuration of interests and perceptions vis-à-vis the European Union that is today breaking up the British party system in the same way in which the Italian party system has broken up and the German party system is about to break up in the last part of this year. Leaving this aside for reasons of time, I will now turn to how not just Britain, but the European region of the global economy as a whole might resolve the cross pressures of the neoliberal interregnum, pressures for both political economic centralization as well as decentralization, for global capitalism on the one hand and regional planning on the other, for neoliberal superstatism and democratic nationalism, and for economic universalism as well as particularism. In the spirit of Polanyi, I will discuss this with reference to the broader international context. Now, I will spare you a number of pages where I'm discussing essentially this interesting point that if one compares today's world with Polanyi's, the position in that world of the Soviet Union is now filled by another, also presumably communist country, China. And there are strange differences and similarities between China and the Soviet Union. But one commonality with what Polanyi attributed to Stalin, and namely this sort of regional, this non-imperialistic regionalism. Now that's something that's interesting in the case of China, which in its whole tradition was never imperialist. It was the object of imperialism, never the subject. And as Perry Anderson has shown in this fascinating book on hegemony, that there is no tradition in China of the idea that you have to conquer the rest of the world and teach everybody to behave like the Chinese. Basically, I think because they, out of a sense of cultural superiority, think that the others can't do it anyway. Yeah? They will never learn it, so leave them alone. Now then, of course, the question today is, and I have to skip this, how the relationship between the United States and China is going to develop. And here of course, I did a quick reading course on China, and there the interesting question is, what does this New Silk Road really mean? Yeah? Now, if this country is capitalist, it has to be expansionary. There's no way, I argue, for a capitalist society not to be expansionary. It has to do this. And whether China is a capitalist society or something else, let's say a socialist shell, a communist shell with a capitalist core or whatever, we can leave that aside and simply assume that they will have to stretch out somehow. And then the question is, what are the Americans going to do? And this is the overall context. They can either try out something which would be unprecedented in the history of the world, that is capitalism to be run by two power centers rather than one. Yeah? From Genova onwards, it was always one, and the transitions were bloody. Yeah? The other question is, can they sort of at least work out some peaceful coexistence between them? That is, in the Polanyi sense, divide the world between them. Yeah? That may also be impossible. And then you can speculate about all sorts of things. What are these two going to do, and how are they organizing their mutual relationship? And without going into detail, I would say that the best thing I have read on this is Susan Watkins's account in the last edition of the last issue of New Left Review, in the introduction on the China section, where she really, in a very sort of smooth way, sees the problems of establishing peace, but also the fact of the huge American military superiority, which might, in the end, get the Chinese to submit to American leadership. And she gives some examples where this happens. So it's a very unclear situation. And what I will do now is drink some water. And then go to the final second part. Yeah, you're looking at your watch. I know I can't save you from the from the conclusions. So, a new Europe, question mark. In which direction, if at all, will the European state system move out of its present impasse? Downward, back to democratic redistributionist politics on the ground, as demanded by nationalist communitarians, or upward to more Europe, last election, in the sense of more superstate enforcement of a politics-free market economy, as asked for by modern capital and promoted more or less knowingly by the European center-left in the name of a new, non-parochial, non-proletarian, middle-class only kind of democracy. For Polanyi, this would depend on the evolution of Europe's global context, especially China and now China and the United States. In particular, the question seems to be what opportunities that context will offer to European centralists to establish a new narrative. Now it's always a narrative. I don't know when this popped up, but to establish a new narrative confirming the historical need for more European integration. A narrative replacing the social democratic European social model narrative from the 1970s, which is as dead as it can possibly be, as well as the neoliberal one of borderless international markets producing prosperity to everybody, for everybody, and economic convergence for all, which in 2008 came to a sudden death. Yeah? In this respect, note the rising calls among European supranationalists for a European army as a rationale for European unity. So Habermas and several political Christian democratic politicians recently signed a petition. They want a European army. The strangest things happen in an interregnum, right? Monstrosities. So building an army is a classical avenue to state building as it comes with the identification of a foreign enemy, establishing a Schmittian Freund-Feind-Verhältnis, helpful for social integration. While for some time now the designated enemy posing security risks for Europe as a whole has been Russia, it is increasingly joined by China. And even in reaction to Trumpist isolationism, sometimes also the United States. European army building as a pathway to European state building had been tried before with the European Defense Community project of the 1950s, which was ended which in the end was vetoed by the French National Assembly. Now it is above all France that is pushing European military unification. Like in the 1950s, centrally important in this is Germany, which currently is about to almost double its defense spending from 1.1 to 2% of GDP in response to long-standing demands by the United States under NATO, but also by France with a view to the creation of a sovereign European defense capacity. Now, if you hear 1% to 2%, you think that's ridiculous. Why worry about it? But Germany, with a 2% spending of GDP, would spend 40% more than Russia. Germany alone, Russia including its very expensive nuclear capacity. So this would be quite a powerful country. By spending 2%, as I said, would become the biggest military power in Europe, far ahead of Russia. Since Germany cannot and will not acquire nuclear weapons, all of its additional spending would be on conventional arms, which would ideally close the gaps in the French arsenal caused by the high costs of France's nuclear force. They have a problem with ground forces. For this they have an aircraft carrier, which they now renovated for 4 billion euros over a time of 3 or 4 years. Our new would-be Chancellor AKK suggested to the French, we can also build a German aircraft carrier if you want some, as a sort of complement. Using defense as a lever for supranational political integration requires that European elites can point to an unstable or hostile international environment, threatening peace, prosperity, and the European way of life, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, of English. While external dangers can always be overstated, like in the case of Russia, real tensions in the international system are obviously helpful. Taking my cues again from Polanyi's 1945 essay, I conclude by discussing 3 ideal typical European trajectories out of the present political economic interregnum. The first would lead to a decentralized system of democratic nation states, loosely integrated horizontally, through negotiated economic cooperation or with Polanyi regional planning, which in Europe would require replacing the euro with a more flexible monetary regime under which southern countries can survive, simply breathe. How probable this is a different question. Globally, this would presuppose something like the international order Polanyi had hoped for, a balance of power between self-contained, non-expansionist big states or blocks of state, unwilling or in any case unable to impose their economic and political system on the world at large. A non-imperialistic, non-universalistic, peaceful coexistence, as the Soviets called it, in particular between China and the United States, cured from its neoliberal one-world sense of mission. Interstate relations, although not necessarily inter-society relations, would be governed by respect of difference. International economic relations could by and large be free from colonialism and post-colonialism, and European countries might even be able to work out a peaceful accommodation with what is now their international bête noire, Russia. Strong incentives to build up European military strength would be lacking. The project of a European army would lose plausibility and become unfit as a vehicle for European superstate formation. And the war on terror could be delegated, as it long should have been, to cooperative international police work, rather than sending German troops to Niger or wherever, where they are now fighting terrorism. Numerous questions would arise, in particular on the capacity of a decentralized state system based on voluntary cooperation to respond to global problems such as climate change, tax evasion, and the governance of finance and money. I spare you this discussion. All I say in this context is that you have to compare with the real achievement of the now existing multipolar quasi-superstate arrangement, and they didn't get much done. So trying it differently might simply be justified by the fact that the way it is being tried now is relatively unsuccessful. But I can say on that a little later in the discussion if you want. Okay, we're sort of approaching the goal. Yeah, wonderful. I said 60 minutes and it will not be longer than that. Returning to the global context of Europe, it appears that just as in Polanyi's analysis, the main obstacle to a pluralist global order is the United States. Having conquered the Soviet Union, the US would have to learn to withdraw from its far-flung networks of allies and outposts and redefine America first to mean prioritizing domestic over international needs. The question is, of course, if this is at all possible. Whether the US economy has become too dependent on its country's international dominance to be able to do without it. In this case, the US would have to perceive the rise of China as a deadly threat, involving diminished American access to global resources and higher prices for American imports of raw materials. Also, continued American hostility to countries like Iran might make these natural allies, not just of Russia, but also of China, which would further exacerbate tensions between the two 21st century superpowers. Such tensions would, of course, advance the credibility of a military justification for a superstate-like centralization of the European state system. Like one used to call Prussia an army with a state attached to it, yeah? And Europe might on this path become something like that. The armed superstate project of European integration comes in two versions, French and German, linked to different perceptions of the constraints and opportunities inherent in a Chinese-American struggle for global hegemony. In both, European state building proceeds via European empire tightening, curtailing the autonomy and suspending the democracy of member states. The French version sees Europe as a third big player in equidistance from the US and China, whereas the German version envisages something like a sub-empire of the United States, joining it in its fight with the Chinese and, for whatever reason, the Russians. In practice, distinguishing between the two is not always easy, as the exact nature of the future American-Chinese relationship is not known, and France and Germany are struggling within the European Union over its finalité, while hiding as much as possible their quite fundamental disagreement. Now, this was as long as Angela Merkel really had power in Germany. Now the disagreement is really breaking up. It's very, very clearly seen. The matter is further complicated by the fact that there is in the German foreign policy establishment a minority Gaullist faction. That's what they used to be called in the 70s, contesting the pro-American majority Atlanticist faction, as represented above all by Angela Merkel and her handpicked could-be successor. A few selected points must suffice to illustrate the differences between the French and German visions of an armed European superstate. The French concept of a third hegemon presupposes global tensions strong enough to unify Europe, but not strong enough to force it to choose sides. It also presupposes the hefty increase in American military spending that is in German military spending that is currently underway, which will compensate for the large share of French defense spending on the force de frappe, on the nuclear force. The French are already spending 2% of their GDP on arms, but you can't see it. It sits in the aircraft carrier, and nobody knows what the aircraft carrier is doing, if it is not being repaired. Since the force de frappe will remain under French control, it will ensure a superior role of France in a future European superstate in geopolitics. Also, because France will, after Brexit, be the only European Union member with a permanent seat and a veto on the United Nations Security Council. German conventional forces under French European command in particular, and if you have the nukes, then you have the command. Yeah. The German conventional forces under French European command, in particular German ground troops, will be needed to fight post-colonial wars in French Africa and perhaps the Middle East, to secure European access to natural resources and keep Europe's Chinese and American rivals in Southern Europe and Northern Africa at bay as much as you can do that. Inside Europe, priority would be given to keeping the Mediterranean countries on board and willing to be governed from the European center, which would require, as I wrote in Le Monde Diplomatique, which would require compensation for the damage inflicted on their economies by the hard common currency, perhaps by way of a special budget for the Eurozone, paid for in effect by European surplus countries. A French third hegemon strategy would also allow for some sort of détente with Russia. Unlike the French European superstate, its German alternative would fundamentally be a market state with strong interests in the European East, in potential collision with Russia, and a high Atlantic affinity with the United States. The Germans always feel uncomfortable if they are hugged too hard by the French. On the other hand, they can't say "don't hug me" for all sorts of historical reasons. It's a classical Me Too situation. National or supranational security would be derived, in addition to European efforts, from a nuclear military pact with the United States. Its hour would come with a reassertion of American expansionism and a serious Chinese-American confrontation resulting from it. We're seeing that confrontation right now beginning to build up. One role of Europe as a sub-empire of a refounded American-led left, perhaps including the United Kingdom in a special relationship, after its separation from the European Union, would be to keep Russia in check, preventing it from projecting its power into the Middle East and the Mediterranean, and binding Russian forces. The armed binding Russian forces that might otherwise support an alliance with China. A confrontational European stance with Russia would also keep the Eastern European countries in the Western European Empire. ensuring their elites against the risks of taking a hostile view of Russian regional security interests, like Ukraine. Preventing, in other words, the kind of regional peacemaking through regional planning envisaged by Polanyi. German conventional superiority over Russia would be backed up, and it will be huge, because all the German money will go into tanks or whatever, conventional arms. It will be huge, and the Russians are spending 40% less, and probably 1/2 of it has to go into the nuclear force. German conventional security over Russia would be backed up by American nuclear power, which would be enlisted by logistical support for the American Middle Eastern wars. For example, in particular through military bases in Germany. Ramstein is a place that very few people know about. And it's huge. It's the biggest American air base outside the United States. And the operations in the Middle East are all controlled out of Ramstein. And the drones that are being sent, they start there. Yeah. In political terms, a sub-imperial European project as a part of an American-led West might be difficult to sell to voters outside of Eastern Europe as long as Trump or another ugly American is in power. But the same may be true under a new leftist democratic president or Congress, which may be culturally a Kennedy of the 21st century, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, but politically even more isolationist than Trump initially tried to be. Now he is no longer very much so, because the military establishment has basically taken over his staff in the White House. Probably the German version of a military path to European unity presupposes a return to power, or at least a realistic possibility of such a return, of Clinton-style American liberalism, or more likely a successful resistance of the American deep state, the country's military-industrial intelligence complex, against isolationist attempts, left or right, to subordinate its priorities to domestic ones. And the Harvard speech of Merkel is remarkable in this respect, because if there was one thing in her career that was sort of absolute constant, was she never, ever took issue with the United States. Yeah? Only now. And now, because these United States cannot sort of support this idea of a European-American alliance, maybe in practical politics, but certainly not in popular politics. They have presented Trump to the German voter as someone who's at least as bad as Putin. And Putin is also very bad in the idea of the German voter. Yeah. Conclusion. An interregnum is a time of high uncertainty with respect of both how long it will last and how it will end. Nobody knows how the United States and China will settle their relationship, if at all. They may for an indefinite period be wavering between conflict and accommodation, between peace, Cold War and war, shrinking back or not from the abyss as they perhaps repeatedly approach it. Nor do we know what the ongoing rapid digitization of military technology will contribute, drones being only the beginning, followed by robots fighting robots as they attack infrastructures and troops, accompanied by ever more sophisticated cyber warfare against vital telecommunications and data processing systems. Equally uncertain is how long the populist defense of local autonomy against supranational centralism will endure. International scaremongering by European elites may push back centrifugal forces, or it may not. French hopes for a more isolationist United States and German hopes for an American return to multilateralism may both be disappointed, as the United States may remain torn between an America First electorate and an internationalist military establishment. Moreover, French and American expectations, nourished by the Merkel government, of a Germany arming itself to the teeth and placing its military under European command, not saying where NATO is in this, thereby extracting it from national parliamentary control, may be frustrated by German voters and parties. And who will win the battle between the Gaullists in Germany and the Atlanticists? The former need a France that is not Le Penist, the latter a United States that is not Trumpist. Perhaps here, too, all one can predict is a drawn-out period of indecision, among doubts whether Germany will be able and willing to pay the rising price of keeping its liberal European empire together above and beyond the 2% for a larger and better military. What we may be in for then is what chess players call a Hängepartie, a Hängpartie, with uncertain event, but productively accounted for within the parameters of Polanyi's 1945 essay, Universalism versus Pluralism, One World or More, Gold Standard versus Regional Planning, Empire versus Sovereignty, Counter-movement from the left versus the right. In all this uncertain complexity and the brinkmanship it may engender, political elites may at some point finally cease to understand what they are doing. And like in 1914, and these people were not different from us, basically the same brains. And like in 1914, unintentionally start a wildfire that they cannot control. There are enough fuses around for this. Thank you for listening.
So thank you very much for this wide-ranging and provocative talk, and a pessimistic one, to say the least. But I think let's turn to a series of questions, both historical, geopolitical, and also economic. You've touched on so many
If you write on Polanyi, you have to do this. I mean, this is what he requires you to do.
So, resurgence of Polanyi is, of course, a very interesting part of the talk, and let's see where the questions lead us. Robert, you...
Yeah, I haven't got a question really, but I've got a comment. I mean, obviously, the other person I would bring into this frame of discussion is Kindleberger. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, what Kindleberger... I mean, he said hegemony was basically unstable, and he applied that to Britain and the United States because the costs of maintaining hegemony sapped the economic vigor of the hegemon. What's your view? I mean, it seems to me that that would mean that the United States is not going to be able to really restore it's just too expensive.
Yeah. That's an excellent point, and of course Kindleberger is present in this discussion. In that I'm saying that in the 1990s and 2000s, the burden of hegemony has become too severe for the United States and it's absolutely true also for Europe for Germany as the hegemon of the European Union. Yeah. The hegemons sort of have two things. One is they get a seigneurage from their position. They have privileged access to all sorts of things. The other is, however, they have to pay for it. And in Europe, as they ruin the countries that cannot live with the euro, the pressure on Germany will become tremendous to push some money over, in addition to the French pressure and the American pressure to arm yourself to the teeth. Yeah? That will be, but these things happen sort of over time, and you have 15 years, so to speak, in which this sort of really works itself out. The other thing is, I've been recently reading a lot by Friedrich Engels, because the Engels year is approaching. And Engels in his final years became extremely interested in military technology, and in the same way in which he was a technological determinist when it came to the economy. He began to think about military technology as a political deterministic factor. And in that sense, we don't really know, for example, what warfare will cost if it is implemented by machines or artificial intelligence. Yeah? In the Iraq war, the Americans had to bring 500,000 troops into the Middle East. Yeah. What an operation! And I think one gallon of gasoline to be brought from the United States to the tanks in Afghanistan. Yeah, 1 gallon, and these tanks use, I think, 60 gallons for 100 kilometers or something. It costs in the $50, yeah, 50 such and such. That's unbelievably expensive. But if you can send your drones, so I don't know. I worked this factor in, but it is, as technology is always, it is to an extent unpredictable. Yeah.
May I just allow myself a follow-up question? So
Yeah.
if we think with you through the bipolar world with China and the US, even if civilizationally China has not been an imperialist power in the sense that you have outlined it, the question is, what we are seeing now is a different kind of attempt to establish Chinese hegemony, both military power, and we should not forget Chinese defense expenditure. So South China Sea's expansionist moves show us very clearly where that is going. And then, of course, the One Belt, One Road story can be read in very many different ways.
Absolutely.
But the expenditure is enormous.
Enormous.
Of building infrastructure which is not only economic infrastructure but dual economic and military infrastructure. So could you think through some of the issues for China of that side of the story?
I skipped that, as you may remember, because I didn't want to speak too long. But this is absolutely fascinating, and there is quite a few points that one can make here. Now, if you have a culture or a national tradition that is non-imperialistic, and you build into it a capitalist core that is by necessity sort of either imperialistic or expansionist, then you have to, and then you have a problem in that society, and it's hard to predict which one will prevail. Since I'm a political economist, I believe that capitalism sits in the driver's seat wherever it sits anywhere. Yeah. So now you will see. Then comes the question of the Belt and Road thing. Yeah. That's extremely interesting for quite a number of reasons. First of all, it has two branches. One is a maritime branch, and the other is the landlocked branch. The landlocked branch is extremely vulnerable to sabotage, political revolutions that the CIA may start in some of these countries where the thing goes through. It can be attacked by commando troops, yeah. Whereas the maritime branch is a different thing, because once you leave your national waters, you're in international waters, and everybody is allowed to sort of move in international waters. It's a major act of warfare if you shoot down a ship in international waters. Yeah? So it's also absolutely true that they are now investing a lot of money in military hardware, but they are not nearly as big as the United States. It is worlds in between, and especially they have no troops outside China. They say. Yeah, you could say Tibet is outside China, but of course, but you could say there is, I think, a very small battalion of Chinese soldiers somewhere near Somalia, for some bizarre reason, but the United States seem to have troops in 80 of the 200 states in the world, if not more. Yeah. And I've forgotten how many in how many countries they are presently throwing bombs. It's an astonishingly high number. Yeah? And the Chinese have not been known for throwing bombs outside of China. So the point would not be they will never do it, but they will need a long time to at least get into a condition where they can say to the champion, let's have a fight. Yeah? That will last. This is why Susan Watkins, in this really impressive article, lists all these cases where they, for example, they try to behave by World Trade Organization rules, they sent Uyghur troops to support American pro-American Muslim extremists in Afghanistan. Yeah, you have to know that the Muslim extremism was essentially funded by the CIA. Yeah, and so no, they vote in the International Security Council. They didn't even vote against the bombing of Libya. They could have stopped it. Although the German foreign minister, who is now dead, maybe because of that, he did not vote for it. He abstained, which ended his political career in Germany. Yeah, he was sort of on the council, because Germany is not a permanent member. He was on the council. He abstained, and then everybody in the West sort of, and the Chinese didn't abstain. They didn't even abstain.
Okay, thank you very much. I do not have maybe so a direct question, but maybe I'm not really sure about this China picture. You know, like it is not a certain kind of idealization, because, yeah, as we know, through Chinese history, there was many attempts, you know, to conquer Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and many parts. And they were able to integrate step by step the huge parts of China with very, I would say, perfect imperial order as a super successful empire. And we knew this, we know this Chinese tributary system. So my comment is just maybe they are not really so unexperienced how to build an empire. This is maybe the another measure. But the second, more optimistic point is that, of course, it is not in all times. It is a huge or long history, but in most part, in good times, this tributary tax, if you can say, was, of course, the China was number one, and in other states was under China. But they tried to do it in the sense that both sides profited from it, you know. Yeah, so the point is that maybe this Chinese soft imperialism would be the better choice for the future.
Yeah, could be.
Okay.
Could be. I've begun to read about it.
I'm not really sure. Okay, but I'm rather skeptical, but, you know. But I wanted to make the positive.
But I want to just make a sort of another speculative remark on this. I cannot claim to be in any way a specialist on China, but trying to. What I'm doing now is I'm trying to begin to think about the domestic politics of Europe in terms of the broader context. For this, the Polanyi approach, to me, seemed extremely productive. Now, in that approach, I have to take the Soviet Union out of the picture and put the Chinese in. At this point, it becomes an intriguing question to what extent the Chinese correspond to the idea that Polanyi had, what Stalin was pursuing, namely just to sit in their corner of the world, or to the contrary, whether there is a sort of imperialistic drive in this system. I would attribute this to the capitalist economy and its need for external markets. Yeah? Now, I understand that beginning with Deng Xiaoping, yeah, the Chinese for the first time tried, at the beginning tried, to get into the capitalist world system by subordinating themselves to the United States. Yeah? Whether they did this forever or just for a period in between is contested. So Deng is being quoted as having said something like, "Do small things, don't shine. Let nobody see you, yeah. But in between, do some things." Now, I understand Chinese is difficult to translate. What that really means is not so clear. But to me, it meant that he thought that for the next 20, 30 years, they could not go to fight with the biggies. Yeah? Now it may be different. If you look, I was in Taiwan, and I was surprised to see how agitated the Taiwanese are about that Chinese aircraft carrier that is now being produced, because the Taiwanese now have sort of shed the old Kuomintang government, which is out. The Chiang Kai-shek sculptures are being carried off to Müllberg, yeah? and they want to be independent. And at that moment, the now president and party chief sort of changes the constitution and acquires the right to govern for the rest of his life, connecting this to his opening speech of the Congress, where he says, I will not give up my office before I have returned Taiwan to the mainland of China. Yeah. So, yeah, hard to say. But in their own perception, Taiwan is part of China. And whenever the Chinese tried to conquer the Japanese, it can't have been in the 18th or 19th or 20th century. Yeah. In my view, but I'm still reading on this, yeah? In my view, the idea was to conquer other countries with your superior culture, so that they all write kanji signs, yeah? Kanji characters, which the Japanese do. And since the 8th century, the Japanese looked to China adoringly. Yeah? What a great civilization this was. And they took things from them again and again. So here, what I want to say is, the last 300 years, the Chinese were isolationists. Yeah, in fact, they were being the Japanese tried to conquer China. Yeah, the Shanghai massacre. The Germans invaded China in the Opium Wars. All the West invaded China in order to force them to consume opium. In the Chinese consciousness, this is like it was yesterday.
Just do one second here, and then I'll give you the last word.
Okay, I can be short because it's still China, so it's not so much left. Coming back to the South China Sea, they more or less want to create a Mare Nostrum.
Yeah.
So there's more or less a complete change. And although no troops may be outside China, but that actually doesn't make me happy, because the other version of warfare seems to be more successful. So actually, how can we deal with it?
Yeah, I'm not a military commander.
No, I mean Europeans. Doesn't mean.
Yeah, I have an instinct on this, which is stay out of it as long as you can. Yeah, but that's an instinctive reaction which comes from my 1968 education.
So maybe it is good to have this question now, and it should not be the last one. I see there's one over there as well. But I would want to switch back from China, that we discussed in length, now to what was in the center of your talk, namely Europe.
Yeah.
And I mean, Shalini at the end of your talk said it was pessimistic. If we look only at Europe, I would say it was worse than pessimism. it was totally hopeless.
Yeah.
And the only thing I would say is congratulations to the Brits that you decided to leave this sinking supertanker. This is the only conclusion that I can make after listening to your talk. And I'm wondering, maybe I missed something, or I missed some of the prerequisites of the picture. I really didn't get it. Why you have this totally bleak view of Europe? I mean, the world is as it is, and I mean, what else do you suggest to Europe? I mean, we are in this situation, confronted with a situation of instability, of a Russia that is, I mean, not always predictable, with a US that is difficult to handle, at least at the moment, maybe for a long time. So what else would you suggest to Europe if, I mean, I mean, it's the main course is, I mean, it's very simple to make fun of the European army project, but it is, I mean, it is a rather realistic view of the world.
I wasn't making fun of it. Quite to the contrary.
Yeah, this is good. Maybe this, and that is one question. And the second, only this relates to the inner European structure or the inner EU structure. Yeah. What was striking in your talk is that you have a picture of the EU where it consists only of Germany and France.
No. I mentioned the East Europeans and the Mediterranean all the time.
At one point, I think, yes. It doesn't matter. I mean, you can. This is why I'm asking this. So no, I was really only a bit. For me, it was a bit of a surprise that you focus so much on these two countries, and maybe it would be a way to say, well, luckily, the European Union is more than just these two countries, and it might even be a help for these two countries. I mean, that they are dominant powers within the European Union. This is totally evident, but there's other players as well, and it might even help to get these two to get along.
Last question. The second question first. So, because my short-term memory is aging. So I answer your second question, and then you pose the first question two words again. I can only deal with one question at a time. So as far as the internal system, no, I mean it is completely clear that Europe depends, now that the Brits are out. Europe depends. Well, yeah, almost. But I don't think they can return. We can talk about this. Why I think they cannot return. Yeah, it would tear the country apart, and the French would, in a way, humiliate the Brits when they come back, in a way that for the next 10 years they have nothing to say anymore in Brussels. Yeah, but that's a different discussion. I assume they are out one way or other. Yeah, now that they are out, the so-called French-German axis, as it is called by everyone, yeah, they are the center. Now they debate what sort of thing they are the center of. Yeah, a political, let's say in a simplified way, an extension of the French concept of the state to the rest of Europe, or an extension of the German idea of a market to the rest of Europe, and a strong currency. Yeah. And German diplomats tell me, yeah, that can very nicely sort of be put together. But of course, it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult because the question then becomes, what do you use the currency for? I mean, you know all this. And the other European countries are on the receiving end now. And you see that in the Mediterranean, you see it in Eastern Europe. Yeah? Eastern Europe is for Germany a big market. It's almost a functional equivalent to what Africa is for the French. And the Germans and the French sort of are arguing what is more important. Eastern Europe, the French are willing to sort of strike a deal with the Russians over Ukraine. The Germans cannot do this because they want to stay on the Balkans and in Poland and in these places. The geopolitics of Europe, I think, are uncontestably described in these terms. Yeah? The other question that you are asking implicitly is whether my somewhat, for the purposes of this paper, somewhat rigid distinction between technocratic centralization and democratic decentralization, whether there could not be a fourth alternative, namely democratic centralization. In other words, could a centralized Europe become a democracy? Yeah, and there I say, we now know that this is impossible. And it could have been among the 6 countries that founded the European Union, among the 27 or 28, it's completely impossible. And in fact, in the neoliberal period, the thing has sort of changed its nature in the following sense. Europe has become a place where national governments can sort of deposit for public consumption their sovereignty without giving it up. In other words, they can always say, for this you need a European solution. Yeah? And then they do nothing. For the Germans, it is sort of very hard to do something in energy policy or in environmental policy. And then they say, we need a European solution, yeah? Which means wait for the St. Nimmerleinstag, as you say, John, yeah? So Brussels becomes a place where you order Brussels policies that you know that you are not responsible for, or where you deposit things that you cannot do at home. And the idea that the nation states will give up this wonderful instrument is, in my view, and of course, someone like Macron knows this. Macron, if you listen carefully to him, he always speaks a refondation, and a refoundation of Europe. He means it. He even wants to refound Europe around the European Commission and around the European Parliament, because he thinks that these institutions cannot do anything. Yeah? And I think in this respect, he's completely right. So if the Brexit had some sort of productive consequence, the Europeans, including Germany and France, but everybody else, they could have thought about the question, why are the British exiting? And don't we have to do something to make it possible for the British to stay in? No. What they did was they sort of said, oh, these strange British, and the British were always strange, and maybe they are fascists, so let them go. Yeah? And in the German public debate, which you might know or not, everybody in Germany, everybody, excluding me, and excluding me, I'm the only one, yeah, who would say the British are mad to leave the European Union. It's such a wonderful democratic place. Yeah? The European Union was founded in the way it is in order to prevent democracy from intervening in the economy. The four freedoms are enshrined in treaties that cannot be changed. The entire competition law is enshrined in the jurisdiction of the European Court that only the European Court can change. The European Monetary Union is governed by a thing called, I don't know, this thing where the Euro Committee or whatever, where Schäuble was the chief, and Varoufakis reports how this thing operates. They didn't even take notes because they told Varoufakis that it wasn't really existing, this thing. Yeah? They're totally undemocratic. They decide what countries are allowed to spend in terms of their tax revenue on whatever. That is, in my view, completely ridiculous.
But what is the alternative?
No.
To economic protectionism?
Yeah, of course.
Leave the politics to them, this is saved by government first, and so on.
Of course. Yeah.
You need the political union of a European level, I would say.
No. It cannot be. I think that's a completely wrong discourse. For two reasons. So if you analyze a situation where something has got into a cul-de-sac, you cannot reject that analysis because the analysis doesn't deliver how you get out of the cul-de-sac, because the cul-de-sac is defined by you cannot get out of it. Yeah? That's my first answer. Don't devalue an analysis that shows that something has been sort of completely moved in the wrong direction and then can't get out. Don't devalue that analysis by saying you have to tell us how you get out. I can't tell you. And then secondly, this is this we. What are we going to do? We have to learn that in this European society, we are not the ones who make the decisions. Others are making the decisions. Draghi makes the decision. Yeah? Juncker makes no decisions, but Draghi makes decisions. And Angela Merkel makes decisions. The Sarkozy made decisions.
Difficulties between Germany and France.
Yeah.
This is a political process of course you have a dialogue on politics on national levels. Yeah? And of course, the European Union is based on the fathers of the treaties, the nation states. Of course, and this is the reality with some different distribution of powers, of course.
Yeah, you were asking what is the alternative? In my view, this is why I like this Polanyi article so much. I think a return to more, let's say, more horizontality in the European state system and less hierarchical governance would be good. Yeah, I also think that the friends of so-called European integration, they attribute things to the European Union with which the European Union has nothing to do. I'll give you an example. Yeah. And that's important, that's significant for the following, for the reason which I will explain. So in Germany I talk about these things and people say, yeah, do you want to go back to railway systems that have different Spurweiten, different tracks? Yeah? So I say, look, my friend, without the European Union, we would have standardized tracks because the European Union has nothing to say about these tracks. There is
Why?
Wait. Yeah. Because we have an association of the European railway systems that works as an independent, cooperative organization, totally removed from the European bureaucracy in Brussels, on the basis of voluntary cooperation between sovereign countries. Yeah? Then that is the answer to resolving the democratic puzzles of this very strange creation. Allow more for horizontal cooperation and replace hierarchical directives. Why does Brussels have to tell the Poles how many immigrants they have to take in? Totally strange, a bizarre idea. Yeah? Why do they have to tell the Italians how much debt they are allowed to take up at a time when debt is almost for free, because the banks are producing money with no end? Because it might have a side effect under the euro. And then I say, let's have a monetary system where these side effects are internalized. Yeah? That would mean some more flexibility in the European monetary system. And it would be a call for intelligent economists to find a way, maybe with national plus supranational currencies, with all sorts of possibilities. I have a file at home like this where people invent these things. Yeah? I don't believe they are all very, very smart, but I'm also sure they are alternatives to the euro.
Just one moment. No, he's waiting.
Okay, yeah. I think this was a very rich menu, and it left me confused and sometimes shocked and anyway depressed. Let me pick up a few things which I found, just at random, a few things which I found really disturbing, irritating.
I can remember only one.
You said only the political right is offering the promise of the social protection. This is true, but if you would consider Monsieur Macron on the political right, because the slogan he promoted was "L'Europe qui protège." But I think to say, and we could have lots of, the same was done on the political left. So I think this is what you call the nationalist communitarians. The redistribution issue is left to them, but then it's not. You have at the same camp, you would have to count fascists pure et dure like Salvini and Mr. Varoufakis as well. So obviously this is, or if you look at the discourse, because once we talk about the discourse, if you compare the election campaign of Madame Le Pen and Monsieur Mélenchon, was really sometimes difficult, shockingly difficult to distinguish. They're anti-German, anti-European, anti-whatever. rhetoric. And so the same, by the way, you could find in Austria as well. You know, they have functionaries from the Arbeiterkammer and trade unions. Once you would not know who made these statements, including press statements, they could have come from the FPÖ interchangeably. So if you talk for a long time the same way, you shouldn't be surprised to have the same results. If giving losers a chance to be listened by winners, as you define democracy, then of course the Gilets jaunes are the example of, with violence you can always force yourself into the political discourse. But it showed, when you look at the election results, you see, how the movement ended up. The European social model, as dead as this could be, I'm, surprised. I'm not surprised. One can be very skeptical.
Are you surprised?
I'm skeptical about it, in contrast to people like Frank Vandenbroucke. But to say, to dismiss it even as a noble idée directrice is another step I wouldn't wish to follow you as with the step of regional planning would mean replacing the euro. I know you were for a flexible exchange rate regime, but could you say how you would consider the design of a more flexible and non-economic nationalist? Obviously, economic nationalism exists only also on the left, not just on the right. And so how would this economic nationalism on the left, à la Chevènement, would look like in your design?
I have no design, but I have an advice. And the advice is, as a social scientist, don't be shocked all the time. Just think. Yeah? Polanyi can, I mean, all these value-laden concepts, yeah? Polanyi can teach you, if he teaches you one thing, then it is that the counter-movement to the advance of markets and capitalism can come from two sides. And that it depends on historical contingencies, whether the left or the right is predominant in that. And you cannot, the only one you can blame is the left not having understood in time that you cannot raise gasoline taxes while at the same time cutting the taxes for the rich. Yeah? And it should be obvious. Yeah? They do it anyway. You can explain why they do it. Yeah? But don't be shocked all the time. Be shocked after you've put your little picture together. In what I described to you, if it's nearly true, yeah, if it nearly reflects what there is out there, then at the end, I wanted to shock you after I've put the picture together by saying that we're living in an extremely dangerous situation, yeah, in which very bizarre things can happen. But you first have to understand why what it is. And what I said was that the legitimating narrative of European integration, which was, you should remember this, the European social model, nobody uses this anymore, except you, perhaps. Yeah? But in the political sphere, nobody says we must unite Europe to have a European social model. Yeah? They think everybody would laugh when they say that. In the same way, unlike before 2008, there's no one anymore who I observe which says Europe will bring prosperity, equality, and cheesecake to everyone. Yeah? Nobody. They now say, you have to work very hard and to compete. And we have to be afraid of the Chinese, and we have to be afraid of all sorts of things. That's why we need an army. That's at least now the rhetoric. Yeah? And that rhetoric indicates something. Namely, what these commercial agencies that tell politicians what it is that they should say, what they find out, what flies with people. Yeah? They don't believe that Angela or Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer says anything without very thorough pilot groups, or whatever you call them, group discussions, where they find out what people are willing to buy. Yeah? The old slogans have lost their force. Now you need something else. And now you see, there's the Chinese. The Russians were already there, but the Russians really don't convince anyone.
Well, we'll take one last question. Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you so much for this incredible talk. I'm totally on board with your picture of Europe. I'm not on board with Polanyi. I don't know my Polanyi, so maybe I have issues with your picture of Polanyi, but here's my concern. To portray in 1945 the Soviets as, and that's not Russia, that's the Soviets as contained in the Americans as expansionists by nature, or whatever, by circumstance perhaps, strikes me as wild. I mean, at least for those who lived or inherited that Soviet experience, it seems to me, looking at Stalin's dealing with the Communist International, looking at what happened to the war, why Hitler decided to open a second front when he knew that's a lethal decision, right? What actually the energies were in Soviet Russia. To say that they wanted just their own region, it does not seem to me realistic. On the other hand, American history, for the most part, has been totally isolationist. The Monroe Doctrine, Washington's farewell address, don't meddle in Europe for the life of you, right? So to say they're naturally expansionist, again, strikes me as odd. What seems to me more credible is that countries, and that possibly relates to China, adjust, right? They grow, they grow up, and also they become each other. So there's something in that Cold War dynamic that made both opponents like or unlike each other. I don't know. And maybe the Soviets just lost, and that left America, right, a hegemon, not necessarily by intention, but hegemony is probably a terrible disease. Sorry, but really I have a question, and the question is why, about Europe, the question is why the democratic centralization, or perhaps even better, democratic decentralization? Why couldn't we have a decentralized union?
That's what I'm advocating.
A kind of regional, but why is that not happening? I mean, now the sociologist in you said democratic centralization impossible. We don't have that regional, and there are also, I mean, regional planning units, whatever. I mean, it's not like they easily exist, right?
No.
The tendency to centralize, to unify, to uniformize is always there. So what are the social preconditions that make something like this possible or impossible in Europe?
The brilliant points. You would have to feed them to me one by one, but no, I think decentralization of power inside the European Union would be a fantastic idea. In that case, however, the governments of the member states would have to assume responsibility for what they are doing. They could no longer delegate their responsibilities to the European Court, to whoever in Brussels. Yeah? That is difficult. For example, on the margins of the empire. There are, let me put it this way, there are a number of countries in Europe where the imperial strategy is to keep people in power who are not particularly representative of their country, but who are willing to work with Brussels. Yeah? So imperialism always has to do with the center imposing on the periphery friendly elites. Yeah? That is good for these elites, but if they had to actually carry out what they should be carrying out in their countries, like, for example, fight corruption really, and not just on the for public view, for example. Yeah? The Americans always had that problem with So they pretended to democratize their periphery. And then they ended up keeping in power people who had nothing to do with democracy, just some sheikhs. Yeah? Because they knew that if these countries would really democratize, oil would become expensive. But they needed the cheap oil. And so on. So the politics of center-periphery are complex. And yeah, but if you ask me, I would say that in order to restore democratic rights and democratic practices, you have to decentralize the power. Because centralized democracy in a place that includes, let's say, Sweden and Bulgaria, you can forget about it. Yeah? And also because these countries are so differently large. Now the Germans, because of all sorts of reasons, they have sort of a much, much smaller number of deputies in the European Parliament, as they might have based on their population. Yeah? Now, you can say it doesn't matter because the European Parliament doesn't really matter. Yeah? That's probably true. But if you had a democracy, you would have the French and the Germans having many more deputies, and then you would have votes in the parliament where national interests sort of prevail over class interests. And that's necessarily so if one country sort of has an average income of 1/5 of the other country. Yeah? Then, incidentally, the thing that I'm discussing with Habermas all the time is that he has a sort of Jacobin idea of a parliament, which is there's one parliament and representatives. Then in most countries that are heterogeneous, you have an upper house. Yeah? You have an upper house in which then sort of many, many decisions are made. In my view, as I have shown somewhere else, sort of the building of a European state, yeah, would, if it worked at all, have to be a state that is so decentralized that you could also work with a loose alliance. The federal government would have nothing to say if these units were democratic. Yeah, the European Parliament, and no country. They take a country like Denmark. Yeah, right now they are turning right like hell. Yeah, and the Social Democrats will win the election in Denmark. They will not allow a European constitution to be written in which the parliament decides how many immigrants come to Denmark. Because that parliament would consist of countries who think that the immigrants want to Denmark anyway, yeah, so let them all go to Denmark. The constitution would never be written that would include this right for the majority of a parliament. And then you can add all sorts of issues where none of the countries that would have to cede their sovereignty to a central parliament, where none of the countries would be willing to accept it. The French would never agree to a European Parliament deciding on the size of the force de frappe of France. It's completely ridiculous. Yeah, when the German, this Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, sort of said something in the early days of her reign in the CDU, she said something like, yeah, the force de frappe would need to be integrated into a European army. Yeah? The next day, the chief of the French General Staff, who almost never gives a press conference, gave a press conference and said the force de frappe is indivisible. It belongs to France, and nobody else can be protected with the force de frappe. You think he did this without asking his president? You think there would be one politician of any significance in France who would disagree with this?
But forever? I mean,
yeah, forever. How long do you want to? How long do you want to look forward?
in 5 years, in
No, not in 5 years.
Important attendance.
No. There's no such tendency.
Nothing is
A lot is fixed. A lot is fixed. Not nothing is fixed, a lot is fixed.
So as I said, this has been an extremely provocative talk. As you can see, it's generated a huge debate. We have several people who are still waiting to ask you questions, but I really think we should close now at 8. And thank you very much again for a thought-provoking lecture, which has raised a number of contentious issues, but I think issues on which public debate is needed, and therefore I really thank you very much for putting some contrarian views on the table. But
they were contrarian, not me.
But views, I think, which really need to be publicly debated. So therefore, I think this is the beginning of a debate. I hope we can have you again to continue the discussion with you. And thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Thank you.